Welcome to The Explainer. Ever wondered how economists actually make sense of our incredibly complex world? I mean, it's a huge, dizzying system. Well, it turns out they have a foundational toolkit, a set of powerful ideas they use for everything, from understanding your local coffee shop to explaining global trade. Today, we're going to open it up.
So that's the big question, right? How do we even begin to untangle this massive interconnected web of production and buying and selling? Where do you possibly start?
Well, the secret is, you don't try to look at everything at once. That's a recipe for disaster. Instead, economists use specific tools. These are powerful concepts and models that let them focus on just one part of the puzzle at a time. So let's grab that toolkit and see what's inside.
Okay, let's dive into the first drawer of our toolkit. These are the concepts that really help us understand why companies and even entire industries behave the way they do. This is all about the nitty-gritty of how firms operate.
First up is something that sounds a bit academic, the structure, conduct, performance hypothesis. But the core idea is actually a really simple and powerful domino effect. It goes like this: the structure of a market. So things like how many companies there are and how hard it is to start a new one. That directly influences the conduct of those companies, meaning how they compete with each other. And that conduct, in turn, ultimately determines the market's performance, things like how profitable or efficient it is. Structure leads to conduct, which leads to performance.
Let's make this real with a market we all know intimately, smartphones. Just look at how this plays out. The structure? It's an oligopoly. You've got just a few huge players, right? And the barriers to entry are massive. You can't just start a new smartphone company tomorrow. So what conduct does that lead to? Well, they compete fiercely, but not always on price. It's an intense war of advertising, new features, and camera innovation. And the final result? The performance? You see incredibly high profits for the top firms, and it's almost impossible for a new rival to break in.
But what if you don't actually have a lot of competitors? Does that mean a monopoly can just charge whatever it wants? Well, not always. This is where the contestable markets hypothesis comes in. It says that if it's easy for a new company to jump into a market and then leave without losing a ton of money, the mere threat of that competition is enough to keep the existing players honest. It forces them to keep prices competitive. Think about certain airline routes. A new carrier could pop up pretty easily, and that threat keeps the established airlines on their toes.
Now let's switch gears and look at a really crowded market. Just picture the toothpaste aisle at the supermarket. This is a perfect example of monopolistic competition. You've got tons of brands and they all sell products that, let's be honest, do basically the same thing. But each one is presented as slightly different through its branding, its flavor, its special features. By doing that, each company creates a kind of mini monopoly on its specific version, and that gives them some control over its price.
Here we see two fundamental ways that companies get more efficient. On the left, you've got economies of scale. This one's pretty intuitive. The more you make of one thing, the cheaper it gets to produce each individual unit. Just think of a giant car factory churning out thousands of cars a day. On the right, we have economies of scope. This is a bit different. It's about getting cost savings by producing two or more different but related products together rather than separately. A great example is a company using the same factory to make both shampoo and conditioner.
Now think about this. Some companies have a massive, legally protected advantage. We're talking about barriers to entry, and one of the most powerful ones out there is a patent. A patent acts like a giant invisible wall that keeps competitors out. Take pharmaceutical companies. When they get a patent on a new drug, it protects their profits for years because absolutely no one else is legally allowed to produce their discovery. It's a huge advantage. Okay, so we've looked at how to analyze what's happening in a market right now, but what if we want to predict what might happen next? Well, that's where our second set of tools comes in. To forecast the future, economists have to build models, which are basically simplified blueprints of the economy.
To build a model that's actually useful, you have to simplify reality a lot. You can't possibly track every single person in a country, so you create a representative agent. It's an imaginary, average person who stands in for everyone. Then you have to assume that their key habits, like how much they spend each month, are going to stay pretty stable over time. From there, you look for a steady state, a point where things grow predictably. But, and this is absolutely the most critical step, you then have to check if your simplified model actually matches up with what's happening in the real world.
Every model you build works with two types of variables. Think of them as the inputs and the outputs. On one hand, you have exogenous variables. These are the inputs. They're determined outside the model. You just have to take them as a given. For example, in a model of the oil market, a geopolitical event or a production cut by OPEC is an exogenous variable. On the other hand, you have endogenous variables. These are the outputs the model is trying to predict. So, given that production cut, what will the global price of oil be? That's your endogenous variable.
Okay, now for our final set of tools. We've looked at individual firms, and we've looked at how to build models. Now let's zoom all the way out and look at the entire economic web, how every single industry is connected to every other industry. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle.
This is where we find the Lee and Teef input-output model, and it's an incredibly powerful idea. It's essentially a map of the entire economy. It works by tracking how much output from one industry, like steel for instance, is needed as an input for another industry, like car manufacturing. It's designed to reveal all those hidden connections between everything.
Now, for this economic map to actually be readable, it relies on two really big assumptions. First, fixed proportions. This just means that inputs are used in fixed ratios, you can't substitute them. Second, the model is demand-driven. This assumes that if there's demand for something, the economy can basically produce it without running out of resources.
A car factory is the perfect way to understand that fixed proportions idea. There's a set recipe for a car, right? It requires exactly 4 tires, 1 engine, and 2 headlights. You can't just tell the factory to use 3 tires to save a little money. It won't produce a functional car. That fixed recipe logic is exactly what the input-output model applies to the entire economy.
These big economic maps can also be built in 2 different ways. A closed economy model basically pretends the country is an island. It ignores all international trade, which might be somewhat useful for a place like North Korea. But an open economy model is essential for a country like Germany. You absolutely have to account for imports and exports, tracking how imported materials get turned into exported cars, connecting its industries to the entire global market.
A really key insight that comes from this interconnected view of the economy is the multiplier effect. The idea is that an initial bit of spending, say from the government, actually leads to a much bigger total increase in economic output. It creates a ripple. Think about China's big infrastructure projects. That investment boosts demand for steel, for cement, for transport. Those companies then pay their workers, who then go out and spend that new income, multiplying the impact of that initial investment all the way through the economy.
So we've gone through the whole toolkit. We've looked at tools for understanding firms, for building models, and for mapping the entire system. So after all that, what's the big takeaway?
You know, the most important thing to remember is that none of these tools are the single correct one. They aren't competing truths. They're just different lenses for looking at different questions. An input-output model is totally useless for understanding toothpaste branding, and the theory of monopolistic competition won't help you map the entire U.S. economy. Each one is a specific lens designed to bring a particular part of our very complex world into focus.
So, the real trick is knowing which tool to pull out of the box for which job. As you go about your day, think about the markets and economic stories you see. Are you seeing monopolistic competition at the grocery store, or the multiplier effect from some local construction? Which tool from this kit best helps you make sense of it all?